Okay, so this is a video that's been requested for a while. It's about surviving biological warfare, or maybe just some horrible disease or something like that. So this is one where I've covered nuclear, I've covered chemicals, so we're going to talk about biological. Now, because I am not really into all the science behind infections and the differences between bacteria and viruses and everything like that, I can't tell you everything, about it, so I'm not going to try and make assumptions where I don't understand them. But what I do obviously understand is that you can make something contagious and spread it on purpose. So, as most of you would know, when you're infected with something, it's normally either a bacteria or a virus. You can get parasites and fungus and stuff like that as well. But most diseases are either a virus or bacteria, or I think it's bacilli, or bacilli is the name when it's bacteria. But the sort of thing is that obviously if you inhale the stuff or whatever and you get infected, then you're at risk. And the problem with diseases is generally the people who have become infected can then spread it to other people, which is the method of basically dispersal. When you have something like a chemical weapon, whatever's first released is what gets people. When you have something like a biological weapon, often it's a disease that's been made on purpose, or a disease being spread that's very sort of potent in the idea that, as many people get it as possible and then they spread it to different people. So biological warfare isn't a new thing at all. It's probably one of the oldest forms of sort of, if you think of NBC warfare, because I think, back thousands, hundreds of years ago at least, people realised that there were, even if they didn't understand the mechanics of how disease worked, they knew that you could infect people with it and kill them. So one of the common siege strategies in the Middle Ages or medieval period was to launch from trebuchets or catapults diseased cattle or dead diseased animals, which could spread plague into the enemy's castle. Putting things like sheep guts or something like that were diseased into a well. There was lots of things that people knew you could do, but they didn't really understand, I don't think, how it worked. But so that's where I'm coming from a bit as well. I can understand how a lot of this stuff works, but not to a scientific degree of how exactly it works. But to avoid this video sounding really muddled, you have several different types of infection primarily, and that's how a bacteria or virus gets into your body. And there is Airborne Threat, which is pretty straightforward. It's where the bacteria or virus is in the air, you inhale it, and by inhaling it, it gets into your body. Things like the common cold and flu are airborne. People sneezing, coughing around you, you inhale their mucus, whatever they're sneezing out, and that infects you, and they're, very virulent. You don't need much of somebody coughing or sneezing with flu or cold for it to spread. If you think about how many times you get a cold in a year, probably at least once or twice, and often I don't think you're getting too close to people who have colds and sneezing. When I used to be working, there was quite a lot of people where you'd go in, one person had a cold, and then within a week everybody who worked in the same place had the same cold. So, they spread easily, and airborne threats are really prominent on things like public transport. If you've ever been on a bus and there's somebody sneezing, you can bet that you're maybe going to get a cold quite soon. Then you have waterborne, and waterborne is where the disease spreads through basically just water. So if you drink the water, you get infected. And similar to waterborne, you can have diseases that are blood-borne or bodily fluid-borne. So things like somebody's blood, semen, anything like that can be infectious. So obviously it's one of those things where if somebody had horrible wounds on them, open wounds, that they probably infect people that way. So how do you protect yourself from these things? Well, the best thing is actually isolation from everybody. If you, say, lived in the middle of nowhere, which generally is always the best case in all of these sort of different scenarios, and there was a horrible disease going around, all you have to do is really board up your house, not let anybody in, and you should be alright, because the disease will kill off everybody who has it, fairly quickly, and then you'd be alright. Obviously, failing that, if you were having to go out into public transport, yes, a respirator would work. You don't need an air supplying one. Air purifying will do just as well. Now, full face gas masks are obviously good because it protects your eyes from somebody sneezing into your face or whatever, but it's mostly the particulate part of a respirator you want, as in where it says particulate and vapour. So you want a P3 for obvious reasons, because P3 filters give the best level of protection, but it's mostly particulate rather than charcoal that stops infectious materials, because most things that are airborne like bacteria or virus-wise, are far too big to get through a particulate filter. So if you had a P3, you know, painter's mask or asbestos remover's mask, like one of the 3M half-face ones, they would work just as well. Obviously, just bear in mind that if something's kind of bodily fluid borne, it could get into your eyes through somebody sneezing or coughing. So, as I said, you can use a respirator to protect yourself from a lot of these things, but you know, if it's something that's in the water supply and you drink the water, this isn't going to do you any good. Whether or not putting infected water through a Brita jug or boiling it and then putting it through a Brita jug, something like that, would that help? I don't really know. I suppose if you were really desperate and it was your last resort, you could try it, but obviously you'd really want to be drinking bottled water if there was a danger of something nasty being in the water supply. Anyway, as of modern weaponisation, I'm sure everybody's heard of anthrax. That's quite a nasty thing that they can spread as a powder that was used, no, it was planned to be used in the Second World War, but it wasn't. They had various places. Russia's had one, Britain had one, where they'd find remote places, you know, and test anthrax there to see how long it took to kill off all the wildlife. Again, I don't particularly know how anthrax works, but I know you don't want to come into contact with it. The more scary part of biological weapons is what are called chimera viruses, or chimera viruses, and that's where the idea is that in a lab you can make a virus that you can choose, you know, bits and pieces from. So you could have something that spreads as easily as the cold, that's as deadly, you know, as something really deadly. I don't know what you want, smallpox maybe, or you know, you could have something that's basically spreads like the cold, but it's, you know, has the survival rates of very, very low. And then you could, you know, obviously splice it so it doesn't, in theory anyway, that it basically has quite a long incubation period. So you might have it for a week or 2 weeks before you start getting symptoms and dying, but all through that time you can be spreading it. So for the first 2 weeks of being released, you know, people could be infecting each other with the illness before people start dropping dead, and by that point it's too late. I think that's like when, if you've ever played Plague Inc. or Pandemic 2, any of those games, you'll know, you know, you have to make the virus that spreads so everybody gets infected, but then they don't realise it and all that sort of thing. It's a bit like that. But yeah, that was a really scary idea at one point, that especially the Soviets apparently were developing one that was really scary, and then they said, oh no, this is too scary, comrade, we better destroy it, and supposedly they did. How true all this is, I don't know, but it's one of those things that you always read about in the NBC sort of warfare books, that the Soviets had come up with a super secret biological weapon, and then they were so afraid of how powerful they made it, they just destroyed it. But in general, yes, biological things are probably the most realistic, I'd say, in terms of a threat level. As in, if you think people are always catching colds and things like that, and not going to the level of Chimera virus sort of level of danger, but I think there certainly is something to be said about, you know, the risk of actual infection from quite nasty, hard to survive diseases. Now, if you've been following this on the news for the last couple of years, and it's not brought up all that often, there's been a massive problem in most developed countries where people or doctors overprescribe antibiotics to patients that don't really need them. And as a result, more and more bacteria or viruses are becoming immune to antibiotics, meaning that what's eventually going to happen is that there's going to, and there already is some superbugs, but you're going to get superbugs that are basically untreatable with any kind of antibiotic. And if that becomes easy to spread and very deadly, you're going to have massive depopulation where you get a virus that's, or you know, bacteria that spreads like wildfire. Everybody gets it, and then it turns out the drugs they'd give you can't do a thing. So that's a very real threat, but there is obviously threats of, you might get a really nasty flu strain. If you look up the Spanish flu or the bird flu pandemic from, I think it was the 1920s, that actually ends up killing more people than World War I, because it was just a really powerful strain of flu, you know, and medicine at that time isn't as advanced as it is now, people just dropping dead left and right. If we had something like that again, it would cause massive depopulation. So, as I said, it's quite a complicated subject to get into. I've only just scratched the surface, and I'm not going to pretend I know the stuff I don't know about. So what I would recommend is, if you heard that there was some really nasty disease going around, probably just to stay in your home, don't have contact with people, practice good sanitation of stuff, using rubbing alcohol or whatever to remove bacteria, boiling water, all that sort of stuff. if you had to go out using a respirator like this to protect your, you know, face and eyes and be breathing through a particulate filter. And then best of luck, really. As I said, I'm not going to keep going on about it because I'm not an expert on it, but people ask for it, so there you go. That's how to survive, or a bit of information anyway about biological warfare and just diseases and nasty infections in general.